front end, and then throughout the deal, getting it to closing. And then Chris Lavagnino, the director of our underwriting department, will take over, and we'll talk about how underwriting works in our processes. We'll look at one particular deal that's a pretty old one, but it'll give you a sense of what we do when we get to the end. And then we've given you some examples in some of the handouts that Chris will talk about when we get a little further on. Okay, so what we're going to do is Graham Sowden is our Director of Acquisitions, and he's not here in the state today. So he and I had his interview this morning. We did about 15-20 minutes where we walked through acquisition process this morning and what acquisitions does, and in particular some of the specialized things that they do. And so we're just going to roll that tape, and you'll get to see us talk back and forth here this morning, and hopefully the video will be semi-okay. All right, so let's roll that tape. We're with Graham Sowden this morning. He's our Director of Acquisitions here at RREAF, and as usual, Graham is somewhere else in the world, not here in Houston, in Dallas, in the office. And that doesn't mean he's not working. It usually means he's trying to figure out how we can buy another property and where it is. And that really gets us to the topic of acquisitions this morning. So good morning. Glad you could join us. Thank you for taking some time out of your schedule. I know you have a pretty booked schedule already again this morning. What part of the country are you in?
Well, I'm in Pinehurst, North Carolina right now. Pretty tough.
The great Tar Heel State. There's some great places. There's some great places there in the Tar Heel State. I'll just tell you, my favorite happens to be the Charlotte Motor Speedway, but we'll go beyond that. There's some other great places. Anyway, but good morning and thanks for joining us. So,
Sure.
Talk to us a bit about RREAF Acquisitions, and beyond the sort of obvious, what does acquisitions do? Tell us a bit about the department's, primary functions, the kinds of things you get into in an acquisition, and I might add disposition processes.
Sure. Yeah, I think, so good morning, David. Thanks for having me. And I appreciate having the opportunity to talk to you guys this morning. Going and digging into a little bit about our department and acquisitions at RREAF, we serve several functions, all from the sourcing and procurement of a deal, facilitating the closing of a deal, putting together the business plan, working with underwriting, working with legal on getting PSAs negotiated. Through the closing of the transaction, and we're really managers and facilitators of making that happen. We spend time working with brokers and working with sellers, procuring all of the due diligence materials that would be needed for any given transaction. We're also instrumental on the underwriting front, putting together the business plans, working with the capital markets team, going out to a multitude of lenders, and sourcing kind of the best financing options for any given transaction. And then we also coordinate the disposition of deals. So when an asset has kind of gone through its life cycle, if you will, at RREAF, we go out and get broker opinions of values for all of the assets that we own fairly regularly. I'd like to say kind of every 6 months. And if we identify any properties that we're able to hit kind of our underwritten or projected return metrics, then we, go to some of the executives and present the opportunity and make a decision whether or not to sell an asset. So.
Okay. Well, that's a lot of stuff, obviously. I mean, that covers a huge range of things. So let's start with an early one. That is on the acquisition side. How do you, again, and I'm not asking you
to give away any secret sauce. Please don't do that here. We're at a very high sort of 50,000 foot level, right? As we talk about these things today, to give our interns and beginners sort of just a general overview of your process. But how do you locate new acquisition opportunities? I mean, is this one of those things where you're just sort of out in the market and you hear about things and then, you start to chase them? Is there a system to it? How do you do that?
Sure. There's definitely some of that. I like to say that this is a contact sport. It's
Okay.
constantly being on the phone, staying in communication with, owners of multifamily real estate, as well as brokers throughout the regions that we're active. I probably touch 10 to 15 broker contacts every single day, really staying in the loop, staying involved in the marketplace, and, maintaining the good reputation that RREAF has and the brokerage and multifamily community. I think we've got a reputation for certainty of execution, doing what we say we're going to do on transactions, and people like to work with us. I like to say that the first 3 or 4 years of me working in this industry, I was on the road 3-4 days a week, all over the southeastern parts of the United States. I was in Birmingham, I was in Nashville, I was in Greenville, South Carolina, Charlotte, North Carolina, Tallahassee, Florida, really anywhere, kind of working on building the RREAF brand throughout the brokerage community and building this network of relationships. And, I think we've benefited greatly from all of that. It's very common for a seller to go to a broker and say, hey, we've got, such and such deal that we'd potentially sell. And, the broker goes immediately to me or, somebody on my team at RREAF. And we source a lot of deals that way.
So you're saying you actually, because of the relationships you have, you get calls from brokers before a particular property even comes to market.
Of course. And we call that, an off-market transaction. So
how many of our transactions would you say we typically execute are sourced in that way, come off market?
You cut out for a second. Would you mind repeating that?
Oh, I'm sorry. What percentage of our deals that we ultimately close do you say to come from market, pre-market source?
Today I would say 100% of those deals. If something goes to market, it's unlikely that we would be players or contenders. We have seen the multifamily market kind of heating up today, and there is a lot of capital out there chasing these deals, and a lot of groups that are targeting similar asset classes and similar markets. And when a broker does their job well and goes out to the broad market, these properties get bid up, creating competition and driving prices up, which, ultimately drives your cap rate down and hurts the yields to our equity investors. And we don't like that. We like to be kind of the only player on a given transaction. Little competition kind of.
Right. Understood. Yeah. It's the nature of it's Econ 101, right? Yeah. So, well, good. Thank you. So to walk us quickly through what you see from the acquisition side, the basic steps in an acquisition process on a multifamily deal. Just a brief sort of overview of the stages.
Sure. And I think, every single deal is unique. And, there's always something that comes up on any given deal that you haven't seen before or, isn't common to, the typical closing process. But, I guess most basically, and, from a high level, we source the asset. get it underwritten within our department, and we do, kind of a low res underwriting to see if the deal fits RREAF's, kind of underwriting parameters and return metrics. And our team does a really good job at calling through those very quickly. We look at probably, 5 to 6 new acquisition deals per day. So we're looking at a lot of stuff.
Wow.
So it's imperative that our team, stays engaged and, has the ability to underwrite and understand these assets quickly so that we can make decisions. After we've sourced a deal and, checked out that the underwriting makes sense, we'll typically go out and tour it with or without a broker, depending on the deal. And, when we go out and tour property, we're looking for, big ticket items, things that, you can't see in a P&L or a rent roll that you may have, have issues with or have additional capital expenditures on. We're looking at plumbing, we're looking at electrical, we're looking at roofs, we're looking at, foundation, we're looking at windows, siding, that sort of thing. As well as making sure that the asset, right. And if a deal kind of checks those boxes, then we'll come back to the RREAF headquarters and present it in our investment committee. If approved, then we'll submit an offer, an LOI, letter of intent, to the broker or to the seller. I'm sorry, I just had a pop up on my computer. So we'll submit an offer to a broker or a seller, and then there's abbreviated negotiation period where you're trying to get a seller comfortable with price and terms and comfortable with you as a buyer. And if you've got an accepted LOI, we take it right down the hall to you guys' office in legal, RREAF legal, and begin working on a PSA. And we spend a lot of time with Darren Harrell on your team negotiating those PSAs, and those take anywhere from 10 to, in some cases, 30 days to become fully negotiated. Right. Once negotiated and we're under contract, we usually put up earnest money, whether it's refundable or non-refundable, and we'll begin our due diligence process. Our due diligence process typically consists of the acquisitions team and RREAF residential team kind of working in conjunction, going and physically visiting the property on what we call due diligence walks, where we'll walk 100% of the units. In some cases, on bigger assets, we'll walk a randomly selected 50% of the units, and 50% of the occupied units, and then we'll walk 100% of the vacant and 100% of the occupied notice to vacate, to get a good sense of the condition that the residents are living in and leaving the units. Kind of get a good feel for what your turnover costs are going to be. And then we also conduct a lease file audit, which is kind of a deep dive into the on-site leases, get an understanding of deposits, make sure everybody that's living at the property has a legally binding lease. So, and then if it passes the smell test and we further approve it during the due diligence process, we'll start looking at our equity and financing options. There's a whole slew of reports that need to be done for both the equity partners and for the lending partners, the debt partners. And I mean, I can touch on those briefly. There's just a couple of reports, like third-party reports, that need to be completed, and that's typically an ESA or a Phase 1 environmental survey.
Phase 1 environmental report, right? Survey
report, and then or a property condition assessment report. And And then we'll also have, a third party appraisal go out there. We coordinate all of those trips, and we like to be on those trips as well, just to, filter any questions, make sure, they're seeing what we want them to see. And I'm moving kind of at light speed, but, once you go, have your debt originated and you've got the equity, in place, then we'll go to closing, and, we kind of hand the deal off to the closing team, Brad's team, and work on, settlement statements with the seller, working with title, and, just kind of all the things that go into getting one of these deals actually closed and taking over the property. All the while we're working with asset management, kind of, filling them in on the business plan, what they're going to need to be doing, as well as RREAF residential, getting budgets and all of the programs for that specific property kind of written up. So there's a lot that goes into it. And I know that was, it seemed long-winded. It's not. I could talk about the processes all day long, but I think
That's a great overview. Thank you. And you're right. I mean, each one of these elements you're talking about, we're going to try to spend some individual week time each week talking about subcategories of that process as we go, so that our interns get a little deeper sense of each piece of that as we go. So thank you for that overview. It's very helpful at the beginning. So let me ask you a different kind of question here. So you've given us an overview, and that sort of gives us some context. And so when you're involved in the acquisitions process, obviously you run into, and I love the notion, and every one of the people that I talk to about our acquisitions process or our dispositions process raises this issue, and I'm constantly kind of harping on it from a legal perspective. Although we think a multifamily deal is a multifamily deal is a multifamily deal, it may be in some general category, but every one of them is different. They all take on different characteristics, and they may fit in larger buckets, but there's always nuances. State law makes a difference. State taxation, as you know, ad valorem property tax regimes, regulatory regimes, licensing, permitting, building issues, if we have to do some reconstruction, those kinds of things always impact what's going on in every deal. So the dive you guys do into diligence, both pre-diligence and then the big diligence process that goes on once we're under contract, is really just fundamental to everything you do. So let me dive into that just for 1 second and give me a sort of a moderated short answer. What are some of give me an example of one of the difficult issues that you deal with once we get under contract and you're looking through the diligence process, something that these folks could remember as something truly significant that seems to come up more often than you would think?
I'd have to think on that one. Obviously, something can come up, on any given asset. I mean, from time to time, we've had issues with, floods or fire units during a contract process. And, say there's, 8 burned units, and I think we're dealing with this right now in the dispositions at a property, figuring out how to work with insurance when you're under contract with a buyer or a seller, how to have that claim assigned to somebody else, or do you complete all of the work, hire a third party contractor to go out and complete the work and, take your insurance proceeds and pay them towards that. And then it's also an economical decision. If we're able to do that and kind of, and you should never probably make money off of insurance proceeds, but, in some cases, if you're selling a deal and you can rebuild the units for less than the insurance company allotted you, you make that decision, you kind of weigh it and figure out, how you want to proceed. But there's dozens of different things that could come up,
Yeah, and I think a lot of them, from my perspective as a lawyer, a lot of the differences we see from deal to deal, obviously condition, you're talking about property condition, and that can vary from property to property significantly, right? But beyond that, just the notion that the differences of state and even local laws or regulations that affect the property regime can have a real effect on what diligence is required and then what the solution set is to solve that peculiar problem. I mean, we saw it in some asbestos-related deals we've been involved in. We've also seen it with, for example, aluminum wiring is something that, kind of nobody thinks about anymore unless you buy stuff out of that genre. So I'm trying to give these folks an example of the kinds of things you'll run into that really are not predictable, but you have to be asking the questions. And so I appreciate that your dive into diligence with underwriting and property management is just a critical part of what you do in acquisitions. So let's close up at this point. Thank you for taking us through this. There are so many other things that we could be talking about, and we really need to do a full acquisitions department run with you, but recognizing we've got a schedule issue and those sorts of things. Maybe we can circle back later in the summer, or we'll get into a real deep dive, for an hour long or maybe 2 hour session, or 2 1 hour sessions in our regular RREAF Academy. That's not, just for the interns. But I appreciate you taking the time on that. So close with one last thing that I wanted to ask you one last question, and that's this one. If there's one thing you could tell a beginner, a newbie, as I sometimes refer to them in this subject matter, one thing that you would want them to walk away with today, knowing about acquisitions, that's important that they remember, what would it be?
Be persistent. If this is something that you're interested in doing, real estate is not like, trading stocks. It doesn't happen quick. It happens kind of at a glacier's pace. And a lot of the front end legwork that you put in, you may not see results for right away. But you certainly will, in the long run and over time. I think, to give you an example, there's a couple of deals that we have under contract right now in Arkansas. When I first joined RREAF, I was cold calling owners all day, every day. And, it rarely turned into anything. And you get discouraged, but, you keep at it. And, 6 months ago, one of those guys that I had cold called 4 years back calls me up and says, "Hey, I'm ready to sell a portfolio of my assets."
Wow.
And it's kind of cool to see that work that you did 4 years ago pays off, later on down the line. It's a great business, and, obviously you all have an interest in it or you wouldn't be here. And, I think that, working at RREAF kind of is like drinking from a fire hose. You're going to get a lot of information, especially with David Cragle, kind of at the helm. But there's probably not a lot of other companies in the country that are going to give you the experiences that you'll be able to get here. So take full.
That's great. Yeah, it's a great closing remark, and thank you for leading the acquisitions department. It's always great to work with you, great to talk with you. Thanks for taking the time this morning. I know you're busy, and I hope your day is productive.
Well, it will be.
Great to talk to you. Thank you, Graham.
All right, David.
Folks, Graham Sowden. Thank you.
We're going to jump right in. Graham talked about due diligence and how the diligence process works in an acquisition, and I appreciate that. I really do appreciate that a whole lot, because diligence, as I've said to you guys before, the devil is really in the detail. it's important to have perspective, see it from the top, and understand what it is you're dealing with, and when you see a particular issue, how it fits into the rest of the scheme of issues that are likely to come up, and whether that particular issue will then transmute or kick off a series of dominoes that will end up in other issues later that you can probably predict if you've seen it enough times where that's going. It's important to understand that the diligence process is really critical. And one of the things that underwriting does along with acquisitions is they coordinate and RREAF Res, they coordinate and dig through tons and tons of diligence. And in legal, from time to time, we'll get questions about contracts or those sorts of things, and someone in legal will read through a contract and give some kind of opinion one way or the other, whether this is going to have a material effect, and if it may, and what that consequence may be, may have to be quantified, which he'll talk about in a second. Quantifying risk, into numbers that can go into a spreadsheet and turn into projected rates of return, projected cash flow streams, and the like. Which I guess is really what underwriting is really about. I've given you an opener today from Alexander Hamilton that you all ought to look at. Get rid of that next page on underwriting. It says, "Men give me credit for some genius." This is not me talking. This is Alexander Hamilton, by the way. "Men give me some credit for genius, but all the genius I have lies in this. When I have a subject in hand, I study profoundly. And then the effort that I've made is what people are pleased to call the fruit of genius. It's the fruit of labor and thought. And I want you to understand that in the context of diligence and underwriting, because that's exactly what's happening here, is Chris and his team in the underwriting process are diligently, profoundly, as Hamilton says it, studying profoundly the details and digging down into it so that they can quantify risks and see issues ahead of time. After you get his practice, because he is, and as practice as I am in our trade, you begin to sort of anticipate problems ahead of time. You've got checklists in your head. In fact, I'll give you a quick thought before we run on to his first response. That was, I asked him, well, do you have checklists? Do you have a diligence sort of, or a process checklist you go by? And his answer back to me was, well, yeah, there's a checklist, but every deal is different. Every deal requires us to think. We've got to stop and look at the whole picture, one element, one detail at a time, and ask ourselves the hard questions. You can't just breeze through it and act like, oh, it's just another multifamily acquisition. This is okay. We'll just check the boxes. We don't check boxes. You can't check boxes and get deals right. Then you start checking boxes, you'll miss things. So just realize you actually have to engage. Every single time you have to engage. So let's engage with Chris here for a few minutes. We've got an underwriting process that involves diligence, as we've talked about, predictive modeling, valuation pricing, and you've got this on your sheets in front of you. Then we have, we'll walk through deal underwriting chronology, what that looks like through the source in the course of a deal, information sources, documents review, debt and equity, cap rates and IRR, some legal issues, and a multifamily deal example today. So let's get into the next page, diligence, predictive modeling, and valuation pricing. So Chris, let me ask you to just talk to us a bit about underwriting in general, what it is and how it works. Let's just start with what it is first.
Okay, thanks, David. I just want to state up front that you're going to hear a lot of redundancy from what Graham just said, and that just kind of is a testament to how closely we work with the acquisitions team. We help them a lot on the front end with the underwriting and the due diligence. It's basically, we're not Department 1, Department 2, we're Department 1A and Department 1B because we're that closely linked together. So the underwriting process, it is trying to take all this disparate data, whether it's numbers or it's more qualitative, it's just trying to take all of this information and distill it down into some reasonable and conservative assumptions on how you see a property moving from its current operations to 12 months, 24, 60 months down the road. There's a lot of things that go into that. It will be, what is the current state of the market? What is the state of the submarket? How are the demographics changing in that area? Is there new construction online? What is their construction pipeline coming in? Job growth in the area. What kind of jobs is that area adding? Are those jobs typically going to be staffed by the tenant profile that you believe this asset to be? So if you're workforce housing, you're looking at warehouse jobs, manufacturing jobs, things of that nature. If you're looking at an infill Class A, you're looking at more white collar, financial services, the fire industries, financial, insurance, real estate, kind of a higher income professional. And there's lots of other things that go into it. You look at the historical of the property. And Dave, you're gonna have to cut me off when you think I'm starting to get.
That's good. This is important for them to hear this.
Yes, so underwriting is also taking a deep dive into the information that we have on a property that we are looking to acquire. That's the financials, the T12. I'm sure y'all are, depending on what department you're interning in, you've all had a look, at least some kind of exposure to a P&L statement. The profit and loss, it's going to be your revenues minus your expenses. That's your net operating income. Pretty simple concept. You're going to be taking a deep dive into those numbers and figuring out where are some of these aberrations, these outliers. How can you explain them? What is being reported as far as what they ask for rent and why they're not getting what they're asking? Do you see a trend in vacancy numbers, either positive or negative? There's a lot of things that you look at from the P&L. Then there's basically two main sources of information, at least on the front end, and that's your P&L that I just talked about, and then the other one is the rent roll. The rent roll doesn't always obviously tell you a story when you look at it. It's usually best to start to develop that story if you've got like one from 12 months ago and one from today. It'll show you trends that may not necessarily be obvious on a P&L, especially depending on how detailed that rent roll that you have is. You can see whether 60% of the leases have been signed in the last 12 months, 40%, what is that turnover that you're seeing, and why, if it's high, why is the turnover so high? If it's low, why is it low? I'm not saying that you want a high turnover, but obviously if a property is getting 80% of their leases renewed every year, maybe they're not asking enough in rent. People are staying because it's a good deal. They can't find a better deal out in the market, and that might be an opportunity to increase your revenue. That's just one of the many things. Then you can go through a rent roll once and pick up a couple of items. You can look at it again, and you might notice 3 or 4 other things that you didn't notice the first time. You go through a third pass, and all of a sudden, you start to get more questions. So that's one of the things that we go through, is that we do an initial look, try and get an idea of what is happening at a property, and then maybe you want to come revisit it later, like whether it's later that day, the next day, whatever, after you've done some other things, and kind of look at it with a fresh set of eyes and see, if there's some things that you cannot figure out just by looking at the numbers. And then, what we typically do is we'll go to a seller, and then with a set of questions, and hopefully they can shed some light.
Let me interrupt you just for a second. Give us some context. Approximately where in the process are we talking about? Are we talking about the deep dive after we've signed a PSA, or are we talking about the precursor dive
It's usually,
in this, as you're describing it?
yes, we're usually in the due diligence process when we're under contract, when you're doing this.
So
So,
what kind of dive will you take right on the front end, where in the first 2, 3, 4, 5 days, you're working with acquisitions, trying to put an LOI together, trying to come up with pricing? I mean, I'm presuming the pricing just doesn't come out of nowhere. You guys are working on pricing together with obviously a whole lot more assumptions
yes.
than you operate on later. Can you describe that process for us when there's an interest in a property and all of a sudden we're trying to figure out whether we can make it have a price that will even work, whether the metrics would work even generally? Can you help us with that?
Yeah, well, I mean, just a first initial look is, what are they asking for and what are they getting? And both of those numbers, what they call a market rent, an actual rent, or a lease rent, or a contractual rent, what are they asking for and what are they getting? And that helps you along in the process to know that, it'll give you some idea of where the property stands. That's just kind of an initial path. That's really just basic. And you're going to look, obviously the occupancy. Are 20% of the units vacant? Are 5% of the units vacant? Not all rent rolls are the same. Some have a lot of detail, and so you can go in and look at other lease charges. Are they getting money for parking spaces, storage spaces, or their, trash pickup charges, pest control charges, just recurring monthly charges that also add to the other income line.
So in this part of the process, are you saying that you get a rent roll up front early on in the process like this before we even go back to them with proposed terms?
Yes, I mean, you never want to put something under contract without at least seeing a rent roll first.
Right, sure. So do we end up with NDA, some sort of confidentiality agreement or disclosure agreement, usually with these sellers?
Yes, with the so even one that's widely marketed to the public, you go to the broker's website. There's going to be a CA that you electronically sign, saying, as you well know, all the legal verbiage that talks about, the confidentiality and the rest. So yes.
So you're getting access to a box in some cases, or some sort of a repository of information to flip through quickly to come up with this determination. So how do you go from a rent roll and a P&L to a proposed purchase price?
There's a lot of factors, obviously. You're going to look at, again, and we'll talk about cap rates later. And cap rates aren't an intrinsic value of the property. It just kind of gives you a state of where the market is at any given point in time. But you'll have some idea of what properties trade at in that market, in that sub-market. So you can take a look through the P&L, see what their NOI is, and from that number, and you look at the rent roll and everything, kind of passes a initial check. Then you can use a cap rate to come up with a general value.
Which would then be used as a bid?
Yes, a bid, yes, an initial offer.
And then ultimately, we end up, let's assume we end up with an accepted LOI, and we go to contract and we get through the legal mumbo jumbo of getting the contract done. You're still digging through diligence. And then we're off into not really a pricing and sort of preliminary modeling, but we're really now going to dig down into the detail of what I would refer to as predictive modeling, right? In other words, you're actually trying to predict a year, 2 years, 5 years out, as you suggested, to the extent that any of us could be able to do that. Right? You're trying to predict as much as possible what factors could be controllable, which cannot, which ones we think the current management's not doing a good job of, and the like, and what we can do better, where that sort of thing.
Yes.
Talk to us a bit about how what those differentiators are when we get down into predictive modeling and out into this 1, 2, 5 year sort of phase.
Well, when when you're in the LOI phase, before you actually have it under contract, you have very little information. So you're just going to be using basically rule of thumb plug numbers. What you think a 200 unit asset, class B, should be running on payroll. There's the whole one in, one out per 100 units, meaning you need one office staff, one maintenance staff for every 100 units. And, just kind of a general idea of what, general wage rates are in that area is what they're saying, is what they're reporting seem reasonable. Again, we've only got a P&L at that point and a rent roll. We don't have a payroll schedule. We don't know what they're paying people and, how many staff they typically have, because that's not shared with you until you've actually put it under contract. And you get, much more due diligence material to work with. So
if we could you flip the pages forward? I think it may be 2 pages. No, that's it. It was information sources right there. Sorry. Thank you. So, I didn't include what you just talked about, but it's real important, guys, and I'd included in your notes these information sources that Chris has spent a fair amount of time here talking about, and that is, as a starting point, the P&Ls and the rent rolls as a real base starting point. And if you just heard him talk about these, you can see on the information sources that are on your sheet and up here on the screen, we've got real estate market data and government data on population, employment, those sorts of things. But he's digging down into the idea of current wage rates for prospective renter types and other factors that we're drawing information from in that process, right?
Yes.
Yeah, so once we get down into the post, we've signed it up, and it's now time to dig down through this thing and build a real model and figure out what we can really do with this before our earnest money goes hard. It's decision time, it's go time. There is a ton of work that's going into this sort of predictive modeling. And how many of you are involved in processes or in school right now are in classes that require you to build spreadsheets with predictive modeling? Yeah, a couple of you. That is a semester long, oh my gosh, kind of effort, right? It can be real difficult to figure out exactly where the tough parts are. And it's one of the reasons I appreciate what these guys do, because I really do know just how hard that is, how hard it is to get it right. And you don't have to be off very far, and you can miss the whole boat a year out, let alone 2 or 5. I don't know, where do you go with a 5-year deal? Generally, we're doing 1, 2, right? And then lenders may require us to do 5, or we may do it for an equity package.
Yeah,
right?
yes, 5 years. And
that's done for what purpose? Why are we projecting 5 years out, just to give these guys
I guess there's a number of reasons. Maybe if we have a pref equity investor, they may have a minimum 3-year, 5-year hold period. And if you exit before then, there will be certain penalties or exit fees or make wholes or essentially yield maintenance charges. If you sell early, they put that money out at a prescribed rate, a pay rate that you pay them for the pleasure of using their money for 5 years. And so they have an expectation of what that return would be on their money or their investors' money. So we do a 5. We always have a 5. Now, sometimes we're looking at a deal that might be a 3-year. It just depends on what our strategy is on that particular investment. If it's, something a buy and hold for a while, then, obviously that's a 5-year. If we're looking at a value add that we think we can go in and upgrade 20% of the units, show kind of a proof of concept that you can put in $4,000, $5,000 a unit and get a $100 rent bump, and that will show a certain return on investment, and then you can turn around with 20% of those units and sell to the next group that will finish that process, then that might be a 2-year, it might be a 3-year hold. So,
Right. And in some cases, go ahead, Brad.
So let's have them walk through kind of how debt sizing and DSCRs, things of that nature, can impact how much we're willing to pay for a property, or how that can.
Yeah,
yes.
so hold on a second. We're going to talk about debt and equity in just a second. But let's finish this part of the discussion, and that is this hold period, as Chris has suggested, is sometimes dictated in some respects by pref equity or priority equity, as we like to call it in our multifamily schemes. And in that vein, I just wanted to add, I mean, Chris has already sort of described what that might look like, but in that vein, there are some times when the priority equity will require a disposition of the property or the project by a certain deadline, by a certain date. And if you don't do that, they then have the right to force the sale of that property. Now, most of those, just to be fair about that, most investors, in fact, every investor is going to want to have the best return they can get on their money. So we find that even in those scenarios, we found in the last 5 years anyway, where we have priority and prep providers and say, they give us okay, this is a 3-year deal. So by 3 years from close date, we're going to exit, right? Even those, if we get to that spot in time, and they're not satisfied with what the investment return would be at that point, they don't force or require a sale. Now, also realize there's one other nuance behind the scenes that you may not even have any reason to think about, and that is if you get involved in pref equity or priority equity, usually you're involved with funds that are raising money in specific funds, sometimes real estate investment trusts and sometimes not, just simply real estate investment funds. And those funds, we never get an opportunity as the sponsor party to see the terms of those funds. In other words, the partnership agreements or the LLC agreements that govern the terms of those funds. But those funds very often are funded by large institutional investors, big insurance companies, pension funds, those sorts of things. And they may very well, in some funds, have specific requirements for the fund manager that says you can't keep this money out on any specific investment more than a certain period of time without the board's approval. And so they'll require us to build that in, and they may come back to us at some point. We've never had one up to now, but they may come back to us at some point and say, sorry, fund board won't approve an extension of this, irrespective of what the market consequence of selling this is now, sell. And in which case, we either sell, or in a lot of cases, we'll also have buy-sell arrangements in those situations where we simply have the ability to buy the investor out at under a prearranged formula as a remedy, instead of having them make us sell the asset at what could be something we don't think is the right price, that we think in a year or two more, there'll be better gains involved. So that's one of those remedies you'll find in legal documents, but it's relevant to this question of how long is the term, and why are we doing a 5-year projection? Now, give me a commentary briefly on what's your gut level sense of a 5-year projection is really worth?
Less than a 3-year, but more than a 10-year. So.
Okay, good, nice. That was a very politically correct answer. Good, I like it. Most people will tell you that who are in the predictive modeling business will tell you, I might be able to get a year right. 2 is really stretching it. I have absolutely no idea what's going to happen in 5. Mm-hmm. And very likely, 2, I might not be able to tell you at all what's happening. And I mean, an example of that would be hurricanes. An example of that would be COVID. There's all kinds of, an example of that would be changes in variable interest rate products. If we have a variable rate mortgage that's up and all of a sudden interest rates change dramatically because of something else that's gone on. I mean, wars and rumors of wars and all kinds of things, right? I mean, you've just got a lot of factors that are unpredictables that you cannot model, and you just do your best to guess out there what it might be. And that's what risk adjustment, discount rating, discounting and all that sort of stuff, that fancy stuff we talk about in finance is all about. But we try to make it quantitative.
We try.
But it's real hard to do.
Yeah, I mean, the end result of your projection obviously is only as good as what your assumptions you're putting in there, no garbage in, garbage out. So, and just as a kind of just a little anecdotal, little anecdotal evidence of that is that 3 years ago when we were borrowing money at, 4.25%, 4.5%, the thinking was, yeah, let's go fixed rate because interest rates can't possibly go any lower. Maybe not can't possibly, but quite likely will not get much lower than this. So lock in your fixed rate at 4.25% now. And of course, at this moment, we're sub 3. It's kind of the, typical conventional fixed rate interest rate.
Right.
So that just
Despite
shows you.
every man's best efforts or woman's best efforts, there are just some things you can't predict. And so you model the best you can and then try to make the best of it.
And that has big implications on the sale leg, because you got the yield maintenance that could be millions and millions of dollars because of
Absolutely. Yeah, so if you borrow at 4.25% and you take out a fixed rate mortgage, 10-year, and then 3 years down the road you try to sell the asset, but the prevailing rate is 3%. So you have to make that 10-year loan whole by basically paying yield maintenance, which is backing into a value that makes your 3-year cash flows. Okay, I may not be exactly correct in how I'm explaining this, but to create the equivalent returns on a 3-year, in 3 years, that would be the same as 10 years at that 4.25% rate. So you pay a big penalty, and I probably just butchered that explanation, but
you get the idea. There's a present value to the cash flow stream at 4%, right? The lender is assured to get a certain cash flow stream at 4%, and depending upon how they discount their discount rate, going backwards for 10 years is a different issue. But that's where that formula gets funky.
Yeah,
right. But the bottom line is you've got to make it up. Mm-hmm. You've got to make it up if you sell early. And most of our mortgages are in that range, right? 7s and 10s. I mean, outside of our non-agency financing, right?
Yes.
Most of our mortgages, our multifamilies are 7s and 10s. We're in that range. And so when we run into this kind of problem, I mean, you're just sort of left with hanging on to it. You just hang on to it. You can't make the numbers work. So anyway, it's a great point. Thank you. Let's see. So let's flip the next one. So that's information sources. What do we have next? Principal underwriting factors. Chris has already hit on a number of these. Obviously, regional and local economic conditions. Real estate. This is a really good point, and don't ever forget this. I had a guy say this to me about a decade ago, and I've never forgot it. And that is, real estate is market specific. It's market specific. You may be a master of multifamily, but not necessarily in Tucumcari, New Mexico, or Mobile, Alabama, or Macon, Georgia. These markets are sub-specific, sub-specialty markets, and you must know the market. You can't just act like it's the same all the way across the board, right? You have to know the market. In fact, you not only have to know the market, you have to know the sub-market.
Yes.
Where that property's located within the locale and what other properties it's directly competing against and likely to be competing against in the future. What the population is like at this point and what you expect it to look like in 5 years, depending again upon whether the local government's bringing in industry, tax incentive programs and things like that. I mean, for example, north of Austin is a completely different place today than it was 20 years ago or 30 years ago because of just exactly that sort of thing going on. So every market you get into is changing, and even if you thought you knew it before, you need to get back into it again and figure out how it is different now from what it was 3 years or 5 years ago when you bought in that particular market. It's changed.
Yes.
It is definitely real estate market specific. Obviously, you've got demographic trends. You see that. The tax situation, speak to that just for a second.
Okay, and this is probably typically going to be the biggest variable or the biggest unknown. You try to make it a known when you go into a deal, and that is property taxes. Depending on the state, they are calculated differently, but there is an assessor in each county that will go to the entire population of single-family, multifamily, commercial properties and place a value on them. Depending on what state it's in, they may be on a 5-year cycle. And also depending on the state, that 5-year cycle may be they reassess every 5 years, or it may be that they have to reassess at least every 5 years. So some counties within that state may do it every year. They may do it every 2 years. Maybe it happens when a property sells, and I'll get to why it's important, is so the assessor tries to place a value on a property for tax purposes. So what they do is they go, when it's time to reassess, they go through the entire, again, population of properties in the county and using various means, and they seem to all do it at least a little bit differently, if not wildly differently, put values on all of the properties that are taxable. And depending on how it's done, what the state laws are, and what the county decides, how the county decides to implement those state laws, can vary quite a bit. But if we are buying a property that's been held by the same owner for 10 years, and let's say that we have it under contract for $20 million, but these guys have held it for 10 years and it's currently valued at $5 million or $7 million, whether it's it's a result of how the assessor reassesses properties on their schedule, or whatever the reason, it is considered to be basically 35% of what we're buying it at, or what could be considered the market value. So when we purchase that asset, is it going to get reassessed? In most cases, yes. And how will it be reassessed? Is it a disclosure state? Is that assessor going to have an official document that tells them what we paid for it? And how do they use that information? Do they automatically revalue that property at our purchase price? Or is there some other methodology they use, even though they know what the purchase price is, that may not be considered the quote unquote value or market value?
Excuse me, lunch is here. Goes on the table.
And why that is true is because not every asset sells every year. So they use a lot of information sources to put values on these properties. If 3 apartment complexes sell in that county at wildly inflated rates, values for whatever reason, how does that affect the rest of all of those multifamily properties? So there's some pretty complicated formulas from what I understand on how they can do this. So, but we need to be aware of that, because if we see our property taxes triple in the first year, that's can really have obviously, huge impact on a deal. Some properties, maybe 40% or more of their expenses are in property taxes.
Right.
So if that doubles, just do the math
It
on that.
changed the NOI dramatically,
Yes.
just that one issue. And those of you that don't know how the system works, here in Texas, for example, and there are similar constructs. Let me go backwards for just a second and explain the issue, and then we'll take a break. And that is, so there are statutes in place, from state to state it varies dramatically. It's just totally a state law issue. But there are statutes in place that limit the taxing authority's authorization to increase the valuation of a property in any given year to a percentage of what the current valuation is. In other words, the assessor doesn't just get to go out and revalue every property for whatever they deem the fair market value to be as of 12/31. right? Or as of January 1st, actually. It's always determined, these determinations are always made on January 1st. Whatever the value was on January 1st of the taxable year is the tax value that gets assessed, or fixed. So if a property, as Chris has suggested, has been held for a very long time, and it was originally purchased 20 years ago for $2 million, and today it's worth $20 million. Over the last 20 years, the tax assessor collector may have, as that property has risen in value and then gone down and risen in value and gone down, just like property values do, the property tax assessor may have been limited to not more than a 10% increase in property tax in any given year, or assessed value in any given year. So you start with $2 million, well, the most that they can increase it to is $2.2 million in year one. And you get the numbers, right? I mean, you can follow it on the way up. They may not be able to get to $20 million 10 years hence under that limit. So they're always under the cap. But all bets are off when the property sells. The moment it sells, the new buyer takes over with the new basis, the new valuation, because fair market value, by definition in the law, is whatever a willing buyer and a willing seller are willing to give and pay for a particular property. That's the definition of fair market value in the law. And that's the definition that gets used by the assessing agencies across the country. Hey, willing buyer, willing seller, there's your purchase price. That's the new valuation. And Chris is suggesting there's more metrics to go into it than that, and now all jurisdictions are using that sort of thing. But that's the reason this issue becomes important. And by the way, just one last comment. That is, we're dealing with a prospective purchase in this big portfolio, this transcoastal portfolio we're talking about. There are two particular properties that may or may not come into that portfolio if we can't structure them as equity sales. And so if we structure them as equity sales where we buy the equity of the entity that owns the property, we may be able to avoid the sale at the county level. In other words, no transfer of a deed, that sort of thing. And it's possible then, depending upon the tax regime, that no reassessment for that implied value would take place as a result. So anyway, we're looking at that issue, but that's tremendously important.
Yeah.
Okay? So turn to your debt and equity page, and we'll talk about the debt and equity. Okay, so what we wanted to do was talk briefly about cap stack and how it affects underwriting. Obviously, it's massive. Y'all understand leverage, so and then that should mean that you would understand the concomitant effect of pref equity or a priority equity sort of equity piece as opposed to simply common equity and what that would mean. So, Chris, just take us through an example of how debt will work, and then I'll let him just run right into cap rates and how they work, and then make your sort of final comments or thoughts on how cap rates usable or not really usable.
Okay. And this is just very simple, very basic, doesn't necessarily reflect real world, but I think it's just kind of instructive. Just kind of showing the power of debt, so to speak. And so what I'm doing is I'm just assuming there's no closing costs, no anything. What we're paying for the property is what will come out of pocket. So if we're buying it for $1 million, then the deal, the amount of capital is $1 million.
You all have these two pages he's going to show you in front of you, so that way you don't have to look at it on the screen if you don't want. Sorry, Chris, go ahead.
No problem. Now, after I sent this to David last night, I realized that maybe I should have done this, kind of put it out 3 years and show the life cycle and how it affects also the returns to the deal. But I think this probably will show you enough just to let you see, the power of leverage. So just really basic assumptions. Assumed a purchase price of $1 million, $75,000 NOI, and your cap rate is your NOI divided by your purchase price. So this first little square here is basically zero debt, all cash, all equity. And with the $75,000 NOI, and $1 million in equity, your cash on cash or return to equity in that particular year would be 7.5%. Now, if we take these same assumptions and say you're doing 70% debt, so 70% of the purchase price, $700,000, your equity then to make the $1 million purchase would be $1 million minus $700,000, $300,000. We're assuming that same NOI, and let's just say that we've got a 5% interest-only debt service. So in this case, over here it's zero. There's no debt service because there's no debt. So 5% of that $700,000 would be $35,000. So your distributable cash is going to be $40,000. It is less than the $75,000, but the return is on a lower denominator. Here it's $1 million equity. Here it's $300,000. So a 7.5% cash on cash return to the equity with 70% debt at 5% annual rate, interest only, that almost doubles your cash on cash. Again, this is not real world level assumptions. This is just to be instructive on how increasing the debt after a certain threshold or below a certain threshold in the case of the interest rate will increase the returns to equity. I don't want to go too far off and talk about the weighted average cost of capital. Debt is cheaper than equity because debt sits higher in the stack. They have first dibs, so to speak, on the proceeds of the asset. So in order to get someone, in this case, a lender, a mortgage company, to provide that investment, provide that loan, requires a lower interest rate, lower risk, lower return. I mean, y'all are all familiar with that pretty basic concept. But here, I took the same assumptions, just increased the interest rate. And you see, so even at a 70%, you go from 5 to 6, obviously it's going to reduce that number. So I don't really remember why I did this one down to 4. I think I probably saved it off after making some changes, and I didn't save before I made some other changes. But so here's just the same thing. It just shows there's the 5%, there's a 6, there's the 4. You can see the differences it makes. Now we're doing a 4 on both, but we increase the leverage from 70 to 75, and you see the increase. I think y'all are all kind of getting where that's going and how the leverage affects the returns of the equity. Yes, you have to pay that debt service, but it's at a lower rate. In this case, effectively, the equity is costing you 15.67%, which is much lower than the 4. So that's how debt affects the returns. So if you pay all cash, you're essentially, that equates back to your cap rate over here. So it's no coincidence that this number and that number are the same, right? Because this is the same as your equity, NOI, not change, no debt service. So your return is essentially that $75,000, which is the NOI, divided by the $1 million, which is the same as the cap rate. So, does anybody have any questions about that? No? I mean, it's pretty straightforward. So, did you want to go on to the cap rates?
Oh, yeah. Yes.
Okay.
Cap rate.
So, Carlos, if you could choose that next tab, cap rates. So, the question was, or the general discussion item is cap rates. And as you saw back there, that is the purchase price of the asset, or excuse me, the NOI, the net operating income, the distributable cash the cash that's coming from the operations of the property divided by the purchase price. So, and everybody talks about cap rates, and cap rate is like probably the best kind of shorthand metric you can use for the value of the property. I mean, it is how you kind of gauge the value of the property. And I said some things in the handout about, it's the worst way to look at a property except for all the others. I mean, a cap rate, if you don't truly understand how that cap rate is how it's being calculated and on what, it can be very misleading. Because when people say a cap rate, are they talking about the same thing? Because this group here, seller, they're self-managed, a mom and pop. We have bought these before. So they probably either mom or pop or someone else that is related, and it's not necessarily the case, but I think you'll start to see my point here in a second, is that these types of assets are typically run much leaner, much cheaper than, say, a professionally managed asset. So you can pull up a P&L and you can say, okay, they got 150,000 revenue, they have 50,000 expenses, their NOI is $100,000. You purchase that at 1.25 million, it gives you an 8% cap rate. Okay, 8%. What does that mean? Well, it doesn't necessarily mean much if you don't take into consideration all of the things we just talked about. It's self-managed, it's run on a shoestring essentially. So is that cap rate really indicative of the value? Not really. So you got to think about some of the other things that can affect the value if someone other than mom and pop were running it. So this first column here is just, let's say, another mom and pop buys it. And essentially what they do is they just follow the market. Let's say that rent goes up 3%. In year one, expenses 2.5%. Well, your NOI has increased a little bit, so your cap rate has increased a little bit. When you're buying an asset, are you looking at what they're doing, what they did last year, or what you think is going to happen in year one? So that is like what you could call a trended NOI, is that you're taking the historical and you're making some basic assumptions about where you think revenue expenses will go, and that would be a trended cap rate. So it might look like an 8, but you think this is year one, and that's essentially what you're concerned with, is year one. What's the first year that you actually are receiving cash from this property? So your cap rate's basically 8.25. Now, if buyer B uses third-party management, like most buyers do, just the simple fact that over here you see these management fees are 0, they plug in their 4%. They trended it, but also 4%. And you can see how that is affecting their NOI actually goes down. That's why their cap rate goes down. So basically what I'm trying to show is that a cap rate is different depending on who the buyer is, basically. So a cap rate can tell you something, but it doesn't tell you everything, even on something just as basic, is it a good buy or not? You've got to think about all of these things that need to be taken into consideration, because here the one thing we changed, we add a management fee. Well, if buyer C, let's just, for the sake of the argument, they have a property tax consultant that tells them, you buy at that price, your property taxes are going to go up 15%. So if you factor that in, right, then all of a sudden a 7.77 for buyer B is actually a 7.67 for buyer C, because they are looking at a year one tax increase. And while, deferred maintenance is not necessarily considered into the price, it is what you would expect to have to, like an outlay to purchase the property. So it takes all of these same assumptions and just says, well, we're going to have to put $25,000 immediately to fix the stairwells and all of that. So the purchase price is not 1.25 million is essentially 1.275 million. And again, that cap rate shrinks down. So if someone is looking for an 8 cap and it's actually a 7.5, you can see how there's some disconnect on who is stating the cap rate and how they're how they're coming about that. And if y'all have any questions on what I'm meaning by any of this, just let me know.
Right, what we've said before, and we'll say it again, the devil's in the detail. Right? The devil is truly in the detail, and in the process you go through to analyze each one of these things to make sure that you go from what you're getting, or what you think you're getting, in terms of the information you start with, and then adjusting it to what you think you're going to be dealing with when you take over. By the way, let me come full circle to one of the points I made in my first talk about anatomy of the deal. Remember I told you that all deals have substantially similar processes and elements in them? Didn't matter if it was M&A, doesn't matter whether it's an oil and gas deal or anything else. This is exactly the kind of thing that goes on in every M&A deal by a buyer. They come in and take over a set of financials or do the diligence on a set of financials, and they have their accountants and their business people dig through everything and figure out what's substantially different from the way they intend to operate it. What things they think are being missed already, good and bad, by the way, and they restate those financial statements not in financial statement terms, but in operating income terms, so that they can then project what that net cash flow stream is going to be and what these equity returns on equity and with debt and everything else in it, because that's what matters to the finance market. That's what matters when you go out and do a deal. That's how deals get priced. And so, I probably haven't maybe said this to you yet, but I closed a $50 million M&A deal with a client of mine where they were the seller and a private equity firm out of Colorado was buying, and the seller was doing a great job of accounting for revenue, income, expense. They were very detail oriented, had good staff, good outside accountants, did a great job. Over the course of 8 months of diligence on that deal, the outside accountants for the buyer, the private equity fund, spent $1.2 million in accounting fees, reworking the financial statements. That's how much work went into their diligence process as a buyer, looking at this and then getting to this from their perspective. So don't ever underestimate the cost and effort that goes into going from A to Z in a buy process. I also said that to you in the first session. Selling is easy. Buying is really hard. There's a lot of work in it, and these guys are doing it. So any other questions for now? I want to thank Chris for his help today. Did a great job.
Thank you for having me.
Good job. Thank you. And look forward to seeing you all again next week.